Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know it's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
Yeah, Mickey's the best. He's always got something cool going on. You know, sometimes you dive into a project around the house thinking it'll be easy peasy.
Oh, yeah.
But that was me last week trying to fix a clogged sink.
Uh-huh.
I ended up with a bigger flood on my bathroom floor than what was stuck in the pipes. What a mess.
Oh, man.
So what about you? What crazy stuff have you been up to?
Oh, just battling with my printer all week.
Printer.
This thing has decided that paper jams are, like, its new favorite hobby.
Sounds rough.
Honestly, I spent more time wrestling with that printer than actually, getting any work done, I swear.
I feel you. Technology is great until it betrays you, right?
Absolutely.
Well, today we're diving into a topic that's a little less DIY and a lot more globally complicated. You might remember our last deep dive was all about the Houthi situation in the Red Sea. And you know how the U.S. has been responding to that.
Right.
Well, we've got a ton of messages from you guys wanting to understand the bigger picture in the Middle East. It's a region with so much going on. It can sometimes feel like you're trying to keep up with a reality show with way too many characters and plot twists.
Definitely.
So our mission today is to help you cut through all that noise.
That's right.
We want to help you understand who the main players are, what their motivations are, and really try to unpack those complex relationships.
Exactly. We'll break down those dynamics without needing a PhD in international relations.
Yeah, consider this your all-access pass to the Middle East. We're going to point out the major conflicts and the real reasons behind all that tension. So here's the roadmap for our deep dive today. First, we're going to jump right into the heart of it, right into the thick of it. We're going to look at that long and complicated relationship between Iran and Israel.
Okay.
We'll try to understand why they seem to be constantly butting heads and what might happen next. Then we'll zoom out a little bit and see how the big guys, the global heavyweights, the U.S. and China, are positioning themselves in all of this. And finally, we're going to try to put ourselves in Iran's shoes and try to understand why they seem so focused on certain conflicts, who they're supporting in the region, and what everyday people in Iran might be thinking about all of this.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's unpack this whole thing, starting with the showdown, I guess you could call it, between Iran and Israel.
It's interesting because their relationship has done a complete 180 over time. You might be surprised to hear this, but before 1979, Iran and Israel actually had pretty friendly ties.
Wow.
But then came the Islamic Revolution, and that was a huge turning point. Suddenly, Iran totally shifted its perspective, viewing Israel as basically an extension and outpost of Western powers. And that shift in thinking, that change in ideology, really laid the foundation for all the hostility we see today.
Yeah, and this isn't just about, some kind of historical grudge or some, war of words. This translates into real actions. Like we see it with Iran's support of anti-Israel groups like Hezbollah up in Lebanon and Hamas down in Gaza. It seems like Iran's using these groups to, apply pressure on Israel without going to war directly themselves.
Exactly. It's a strategy of indirect engagement, allowing Iran to exert influence and challenge its adversaries without triggering a full-scale direct war.
There's like a calculated risk.
It seems that way. And the sources we've been looking at really emphasize how deep this support network goes.
Oh, yeah.
Iran's been training and arming Hezbollah since the 1982 Lebanon War. That's a long time. That's decades of investment. And this support for these groups is a key part of what Iran calls its resistance axis. It's all about pushing back against what they see as Western, meddling in the region.
Right.
They view themselves as leading the charge against Western dominance in the region.
And this goes beyond just money and weapons, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We saw a pretty major escalation just recently in April of this year when Iran actually launched its first ever direct attack on Israel.
Right.
And we're talking about hundreds of drones and missiles, over 300. That's a big deal.
Absolutely. It marked a turning point, and our sources clearly state this was in direct retaliation for an Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria.
So it's a real shift from those proxy fights to direct confrontation.
Definitely, even if many of those projectiles were intercepted.
So from Iran's point of view, all this support for these groups, these direct attacks, what's their justification?
Well, if you look at it from their perspective, they see Israel as a fundamental threat to their security.
Okay.
So supporting these groups is seen as a necessary step, as a way to push back against Western dominance in the region, and ultimately to undermine Israel's legitimacy in their eyes.
When you say Iran views Israel as an extension of Western imperialism, what exactly does that mean in their view?
It ties back to historical Western colonial influence in the Middle East.
Right.
They see Israel as a key ally and instrument of Western powers in maintaining their dominance in the region.
It's fascinating how these deeply ingrained historical and ideological viewpoints fuel the conflict even today.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got a grasp on the Iran-Israel dynamic now, that face-off. So let's bring in the big guys, the global powerhouses, the U.S. and China. What roles are they playing in this messy situation?
The U.S. role has been fairly consistent. They've been a strong ally of Israel for decades, providing a lot of military aid.
Right.
And that includes things like advanced weaponry, missile defense systems, and consistent diplomatic backing. And we see this especially during Israel's conflicts with groups like Hamas, where the U.S. often steps in with military assistance and tries to mediate diplomatically.
Like back in October 2023 when Hamas attacked.
Exactly. Our sources highlight the U.S. military support sent after that attack as a prime example of that commitment to Israel.
But Iran definitely doesn't see the U.S. as some impartial peacemaker, do they?
No, not at all. Iran sees the U.S. as a major cause of instability in the region. They're very critical of U.S. support for Israel and obviously those tough sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. And, that tension really went through the roof after Iran's direct attack on Israel in April.
So essentially, they see the U.S. as actively siding with their enemy.
Exactly.
And the U.S. has tried different tactics to deal with, there have been efforts to limit their nuclear program to try to stop their support for these proxy groups.
Yeah. Our sources mention the Biden administration's efforts, including the release of some Iranian assets as an attempt to revive the nuclear agreement.
But from what I understand, it didn't really go as planned, did it?
From the Iranian perspective, it was seen as a sign of weakness from the U.S. rather than a genuine move towards better relations.
Okay. So that's the U.S. side of things. What about China? They seem to be taking a completely different approach.
Yeah, they definitely have. They've built very strong economic ties with Iran, especially when it comes to oil. This relationship really got cemented by that 25-year agreement back in 2021. China's investing a lot in Iran in exchange for a steady supply of oil. So this economic partnership is really at the core of their relationship.
So it's more about strategic patience and less about direct intervention like the U.S.
It seems that way. They're leveraging their economic power while advocating for stability, which ultimately benefits their trade interests.
So when it comes to the actual conflict between Iran and Israel, or even the broader regional tensions, where does China really stand? They haven't exactly been sending warships or issuing strong condemnations, have they?
No, our sources suggest a more neutral stance from China. They've consistently called for peace and stability in the region.
Okay.
And importantly, China played a big role in brokering that agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023. A lot of people saw that as a really positive step towards de-escalation.
That was a surprise for many people. But does their economic partnership with Iran mean they're also backing them militarily, especially when it comes to those actions against Israel or the stuff happening in the Red Sea?
Well, based on what we've seen, despite the close economic ties, there's no clear evidence that China's directly supporting Iran's military actions in those specific areas.
Yeah.
China seems to be primarily focused on their own economic interests, making sure they have a secure energy supply.
Right.
They don't really seem to want to get tangled up in those military and political complexities of the region.
It's fascinating to see these two global powers, the U.S. and China, operating with such different playbooks.
Yeah.
The U.S. has been that long-term military and diplomatic backer of Israel, and China is more focused on business and playing that quieter diplomatic role. It really highlights how these different approaches and priorities shape the dynamics of the whole Middle East.
And each of these global players has its own agenda, its own set of interests, and their actions and policies reflect those priorities.
All right, so we've looked at those external players, but now let's try to understand what's driving Iran's actions. Some people might say that they seem fixated on conflict, on supporting groups like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. But is it really some kind of obsession, or is there a deeper, more complex explanation?
Our sources show that it's definitely not just a random obsession with conflict. These actions are a core part of Iran's foreign policy, and there are historical, ideological, and strategic reasons for them.
Let's break that down, starting with the historical and ideological factors.
Right. So as we mentioned earlier, that 1979 Islamic Revolution was a massive shift. It established Iran as a leading force against Western influence, supporting groups that oppose Israel. And this ideology continues to be a major driving force behind their foreign policy today.
So they see themselves as champions of those resisting Western influence.
Absolutely. They view themselves as a counterweight to those Western powers in the region.
But it can't just be about ideology, right?
Oh, of course not.
There have to be some practical strategic goals at play, too.
Definitely. Iran has clear strategic interests in expanding its influence across the region, pushing back against its rivals like the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And by backing these proxy groups, they're able to create multiple fronts in potential conflicts.
Like the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea.
Exactly. Those attacks disrupt international shipping and put pressure on their adversaries. It's another example of that strategy of indirect engagement, allowing Iran to exert influence and challenge its adversaries without triggering a full-blown war.
So it's a calculated risk.
It seems to be.
And what about the religious aspect? I mean, we know Iran is a Shia-majority country, and some of the groups they support, like the Houthis in Yemen, also have Shia connections. Does that play a role?
Absolutely. It adds another layer to those relationships. There's definitely a sense of religious solidarity with Shia communities in other countries.
So it's this mix of ideology, strategic goals, and religious ties that shapes Iran's actions. But those policies haven't come without a cost, have they? I mean, there have been pretty significant economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation as a result.
You're right. Iran has faced heavy sanctions and become quite isolated diplomatically because of these policies. And some observers believe that the Iranian government is prioritizing these external conflicts and their ideological goals over addressing those domestic issues.
Which brings us to the people within Iran. How do they feel about all of this? Is there widespread support for the government's actions, or are there different perspectives?
Based on our sources, it seems like there's a range of views among Iranians. It's not a simple black and white situation.
So what are some of the different perspectives?
Some Iranians definitely support the government's actions. They see it as a necessary form of resistance against Western aggression, especially when it comes to supporting Palestine and Lebanon.
Okay.
Our sources even mention reports of celebrations in some Iranian cities after the April attack on Israel, which suggests that there is a segment of the population that's in line with these policies.
But we've also heard about protests and criticism within Iran.
That's right. There are definitely people in Iran who are critical of these policies. Their main concern is that these actions actually worsen the economic situation and lead to greater isolation from the rest of the world.
So it's more of a mixed bag.
Exactly. And it's tough to get a truly accurate picture of public opinion when the government controls the media and restricts free speech.
Right. It's a reminder that things are never quite as simple as they might appear from the outside.
Exactly. There are always those nuances and internal divisions that need to be considered. And earlier you mentioned some other factors that make the Middle East so complex.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot more to the story.
To grasp the bigger picture, we also need to understand those religious and sectarian conflicts, especially the divide between Shia and Sunni Muslims.
Right.
And then there's the huge role that energy resources play in the region's politics.
It's a massive factor.
And of course, the lasting impact of the Palestinian issue and the ongoing proxy wars between regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where all the pieces are constantly shifting.
Exactly. It's a region with so many interconnected factors that make it really volatile.
So as you can see, it's a lot to take in.
It is.
But hopefully, this deep dive has given you a better grasp of these intricate relationships and those complex motivations at play. Just to recap, we've looked at how the histories and goals of Iran, Israel, the U.S., and China are all tangled up. And we've also considered those varying viewpoints within Iran about these regional conflicts.
Right.
And really, understanding these dynamics is crucial for making sense of what's happening in the Middle East now and anticipating what might happen in the future.
It's a region that's always evolving. And considering those internal divisions within Iran and those economic challenges they face, it raises a question. How might these factors shape their future decisions, their involvement in conflicts going forward?
That's a great point. And what role might public opinion play, even in a country where the government has a lot of control?
It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Now, on a lighter note, if you're looking for something fun and different after all this serious stuff, our good friend Micky just launched his own YouTube channel.
Oh, that's cool.
It's called Mickytolife.
Mickytolife.
Yeah.
What's he doing on there?
He's doing these travel vlogs, but he's also doing whiskey and other alcohol unboxings and sharing his original music.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it's a cool mix. So if you need a little mental break after our deep dive, go check out Mickytolife.
I think I will.
We'll put the link in the show notes. So as always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope we've given you some new perspectives on the complex situation in the Middle East. We'll catch you in the next one.